Hello everybody, and welcome to Exporting to PDF in React Part 2. My name is Carl Bergenhem, I'm the Product Manager for Kendo React, and in this video we're going to continue our adventure into exporting HTML and CSS to PDF. Specifically, today we're going to cover a common scenario of exporting invoices to PDF, and we're going to extend what we already have available by including SVG elements and some data visualizations and charts in our content. We're going to utilize a Kendo React dropdown to customize the layout, and this means that we're going to modify the paper size depending on user requirements. Now, as a reminder, this paper size can be set both through CSS and through available props. In today's example, we're going to be covering the CSS approach, and we're also going to dive into exporting non-Unicode characters in our PDF files. Now, without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into the video. Now, this example that we have here is pretty simplistic, right? Just a couple of different h1 tags, a p tag, div tag, just some basic HTML elements. Now, let's go ahead and build out something a little bit more advanced. And for that, I am going to copy and paste in some code. However, we will have links to a sample repository where you'll be able to copy and paste the same code yourself. So to start off with, I'm going to just go ahead and replace all the HTML that I have in here with my own custom HTML. And we'll see here that a company logo is not defined, which is actually an image that we have here. So I'm just going to call this, replace what we have with the Kendo here, and just say company logo, and then from the company logo PNG. So over here on the left-hand side, we see that we have some new content now that is starting to look and feel like an invoice of some kind, right? As we can see it with invoice 4. All right, we also need some styling, so I'll copy and paste some of that in as well. So I'll jump into app.css, go ahead and replace everything that we have in here, and we'll see that now we do get something that looks far more like an invoice. I'm not going to jump into the specifics of the CSS that we applied here, but it is still something to keep in mind that we do have all this different CSS to help manage just making things look nice and pretty. So if I close out app.css, I can now start looking into how we might want to start exporting this content into PDF. Now, right now, this is just some basic HTML, so I want to show you how you can use some more advanced components when you export content. Specifically, I want to start adding some Kendo React charts and data visualizations into our invoice in order to allow us to be able to export something that is SVG based. So to do this, I'll go over to my docs and demos, and right now we're on PDF processing, and I'm going to go ahead and just open a new tab with our other components. And if I scroll down, we see here that, yep, lo and behold, we have a charts package within Kendo React. So I'll click on that, jump over to the Getting Started section in order to be able to grab the Npm Installation Instructions. So I'll copy my code here, and I'll open up my terminal again and go ahead and run this command. And now that my application is up and running, I'll just jump in and see, well, what kind of charts do I want? If I go to the overview page here, we can see that we have a full list of charts that we might want to utilize. And in my particular case, I do like the idea of working with maybe a donut chart or a pie chart. So we can see here what the pie chart, for example, looks like in order to be able to display some additional content. Now, if I go into view source, we see here that we have a couple of imports that we can do. So I'll go ahead and just copy and paste this and toss that into the rest of my import statements here. And then from here, we're free to really use any and all Kendo React charts. So for this, I'm going to employ some movie magic and copy in some additional HTML within my application. Specifically, I'm going to scroll down to a section that we have here already called PDF chart, and I'll go ahead and just paste in my chart code. Go ahead and hit save. Pop back over into our application. We see now that there are two things that are missing. One is the sample data variable, which is the data that I want to pass in. And another one is the chart series label is not defined. Well, we can fix that by scrolling up and just importing that as well. Now we do have to take care of sample data as well. So I'm going to actually create a new file called invoice data.json. I have some code already copied and pasted in here now. So it's just a simple array where every object has a product and share field. And then I'll go into app.js, and within here, I'll just go ahead and import sample data from that file we just created. All right, and immediately we see now that I have this donut chart up and running with the content readily available. Now, just to make sure that you understand where that's coming from, let me scroll down. We'll see here that we passed in the data, and then we have two different fields, the category field and the field. Now, the category field is related to product, which under here is the label that we'll use here. So chicken, pork, turkey, Kobe beef, pickled herring, and bison. And then the share is just how big of a share that we want to have defined as well. So we just pass that in as the field here. Now, if you're not too sure where all this is coming from and the declarative structure here that we have, again, we can look into the documentation for anything that we want to take a peek at. So if we open up this chart section, we see that we have a ton of different aspects of charts, including the axes, the content area, etc. But in this particular case, we are just simply setting up the types here and then defining a chart series label that is the thing that allows us to be able to have this white text here representing the field. So nothing too crazy, but what is interesting is that if I inspect this, we'll see that this is right now just an SVG file that we have included within our application. All right, now I think it's time to create a little area where we can, again, click a button in order to be able to export some content. So let's go ahead and do so by scrolling up and taking a peek at the top of the page and what we can do here. So what I'm going to do is under my first div here, I'm just going to paste in some more code. And all this is doing is giving us just a little content area where we can select the page size, which we will eventually do, and we'll build that out. And then we can also export PDF. And again, we see here that we have a event handler that we need to work with, right? So a handle export with component, which from our previous code we already have available. And once I click that, I should be able to just export the content. But first, let's just jump through handle export with component, what that's doing. We are again using this event handler up here, and I'll actually even remove export with method. And then handle export with component uses the reference that we've defined here, right, of the use ref down here with the PDF export component. And from this, we will simply just call current.save, and that will export all the content contained within this particular tag. So everything within here will be exported. So everything below this area is wrapped around with the PDF export component, and that's what will be exported. So if I do this, go ahead and click export, we can see here that we get a nice and exported PDF file that represents very similar to what we have over here. Although we see that Mexico and Juarez, where we have maybe some special characters, and same thing with the U with the umlaut on top of it here, we see that we get some issues in the exported content. And why is that? This is actually because the standard PDF fonts do not support Unicode characters. So what we need to do in this particular case is actually import the specific font that we want to use when we're exporting content as a part of the overall CSS of this component, and then be able to use that and embed that within the PDF exportation in order to be able to have some custom font. Now keep in mind that in order to be able to do this, you do need to have a license to these fonts. So in my example, I'm going to use something that you do not need to have a license for in order to make sure that this is something you can freely start using. Specifically, if we take a look at what we had in app.css, and if I scroll up to the top here, we can see that I already included something related to this in the CSS. I just commented it out. And specifically, we're going to pass in Deja Vu Sans or Arial Sans Serif as the backup here. And this is, again, in order to ensure that we can have Unicode characters within our application. Now, in order to start using Deja Vu Sans, and in order to use it as a part of what we're exporting, we also need to use @fontface within our CSS in order to be able to pull in the font files that we need. Again, you could potentially pull this in from your own CDN or include it locally. In this particular case, we happen to use the Kendo UI CDN for this example, but wherever you're pulling these files from and using app font face, those are the two criteria that you need in order to be able to ensure that this can be a part of your exported PDF. If I close down app.css and invoice data.json and jump back into our React application here, we should see that the font has slightly changed what we had here compared to what we have up here. So just go ahead and refresh that so we can see now the change happen before our eyes. And now if I go ahead and export, we'll see that we now do get these characters. You can see the big difference here between the two different exported files. So the latest export does look a lot better, although we do see here that we have a little break here. So what I'm just going to do is, for the sake of this demo, I'm just going to call this the deli instead of the full delicatessen. So if I close this down, export the content, we'll now see that everything is on one line here, which of course we can change with some additional CSS if we like to. All right, now that this content is being exported, I do also want to take a look at one more thing that we could potentially do here. Specifically, I want to work on defining different page sizes so you can take a look at what exactly that looks like within an application. As we mentioned in the first video, we can support A0 through 10, B0 through 10, C0 through 10, and a bunch of other formats that automatically can be exported in PDF. So right now we've been working with an A4 format, and we can just change that to see what that looks like between the different sizes that we have available. Now, rather than hard code this, which we've actually done down here, we can see that we have a class name, we have PDF page, and then we have size A4. And this, by the way, is all CSS that we just have included in app.css. So if I pop back in here, scroll down all the way to the bottom, we see here that we have A4 letter executive, and then we even have a PDF header aspect for executive that we can throw in. But these are all just predefined sizes that we know. This isn't something that we made up. These are the sizes of these different types of paper. Something that's important to keep in mind with PDF exportation is not only, of course, you want to stick to a particular paper size, it could be helpful if then your end users end up printing that content and want to print it to a particular type of paper as well. So now that we know that we need to be able to switch between size A4, size letter, and size executive, we know that we have 3 different options. And what's a good component to use in order to be able to select from a couple different predefined options? I think a drop-down list is in order. So let me go ahead and close app.css and be back in our application here. And I'm going to probably say that here on just like page size is where a drop-down list will go. Well, we haven't added one to our application yet, and I don't want to use a regular select element because right now everything is nice and styled to the material design specifications. So let's go ahead and see what Kendo React can offer us. I'm going to go back into the overview of the components available. And wouldn't you know it, we have a drop-downs package with a lot of different types of drop-downs. In this particular case, I'm going to go ahead and just work with a drop-down list. And we can, of course, see what that looks like here within the view source. But we do know that we do need to start working with this import statement here, first of all. And of course, we need to run an npm install. So let's go ahead and find that. So under my overview here, and we see the basic usage where we can dive in and see how you can implement the different types of dropdowns. But here we also have installation. So we're just importing the Kendo React dropdowns really. And let me jump back into my terminal. And now that my application is loaded again, let me go back into my documentation, go to the dropdown list, look at the getting started, and see what we need to do in order to be able to use this component. So I'll copy and paste the import here first of all. There we go. And now we can see that something very easy for us to do is just have a drop-down list with some data that we can pass in from an array that we have within our application. So first of all, I'm just going to go ahead and actually work with the drop-down list. So we'll add in drop-down list as an element. There we go. Open and close tags. So as we head over to my application, we see that we have a drop-down readily available already, and I can click on this drop-down and we see no data found because we haven't passed in any data, but we already have a fully functioning component. So let's go ahead and pass in some data into our drop-down list. So for this, we'll go ahead and, since we're not using this variable, I'll just remove it as well, but we'll pass in a new variable here that allows us to be able to just have an array of some different content. And specifically, we want each object to have some text, which is the text that's going to be displayed within the dropdown. And then we want the value to be equal to those CSS classes that we had within app.css. Now, in order to use this, we could just go into the drop-down list and just call data prop and pass in dd data. And when this is rendered, we'll see now that we have 3 objects in here. So we need to be able to take these objects now and define which field is responsible for displaying and which field is responsible for the underlying value. And this can be done, again, if we look into the different options that we have available here within our documentation. We can go to data binding and value binding. And if we go into the view source here, we see that we have a similar setup with text and ID. And if I look down here, we see that we have a text field and a data item key that we're going to be using. So in our case, we will go ahead and just say that the text field is equal to text. And then the data item key is equal to value. So if we pop back into our app, we see that in the drop-down, we have A4, letter, and executive. So we can start selecting these, and we also see that styling is applied to the currently selected item. Now, this isn't really doing anything beyond just showing that A4, letter, and executive are being displayed here. Nothing's actually really happening within our application. So let's change that. Let's have a variable be responsible for what is currently selected within the dropdown. So in order to do that, I'm going to go ahead and start actually play around with some state within my application. So in order to do that within React, of course, we need to not just have use ref, but we also need to have use state. And then I'll go ahead and define a variable, and I'll do layout selection. And then we need to, of course, do set layout selection. It'll be equal to use state. And then within use state, we want to be able to pass in the initial state of this variable. And in this particular case, because we already have A4, right? That's already how this is set up. Let's make that the default option. So in this particular case, I'll just pass in the object, and I'll just say text A4, and then the value will be size A4. All right, so now we have layout selection there. And in order for this to apply then to the dropdown, because it's not currently selected, right, even though it is our default, so let's go ahead and say that our value is equal to layout selection. And we'll see that immediately over on the left-hand side, A4 is now the initial thing that is displayed when the page loads. If I refresh the page again, we'll see now that we have A4. Perfect. We still don't have anything that happens when we actually select an item, and now we actually see that the value doesn't change, right? Because it's bound to the state of layout selection, which never changes. On the selection change, which is actually an on-change event within the drop-down list, we want to be able to go ahead and update the state of layout selection. So in this case, I'll go ahead and define an on-change event that we can work with, and I'll call it update page layout, and then we'll handle that up here. So this will now be fired anytime that dropdown changes. And now I'll just call set layout selection, and I'll pass in what we want to set this to, which will be event target value. Now, when we pop in here, we'll see that when we update the selection, the component correctly displays which item we've currently selected, but nothing's changing within the HTML. How do we do that? Well, this is something that we can work with within our React code. So if I scroll down, we can see here that there is one particular div that's responsible for the size. So if I remove this portion of PDF page, we'll see that things change kind of drastically over here on the left-hand side. So this is where we want to be able to pass in the CSS class that is responsible for the page size. And this can be done if we work with the layout selection option, right? So if we just pass in layout selection, and then we do know that this is an object, and what part of that object is responsible for these strings right here? The value. So we can just say layout selection dot value. And if I jump over to my application, we see that letter was already selected. But when I go through A4, letter, and executive, we now see that the layout changes within my application. This is all thanks to CSS and, of course, setting those constraints that we did around this content. So let's export each one. And we'll open them all in order. We can now see that while they are slightly different, we do have different layouts available within each exported PDF file. So hopefully this shows you the power of PDF processing and how you can even start using your own CSS classes and something like a dropdown in order to be able to customize the layout of your application and have it fit with the different paper sizes that we might want to be able to adhere to depending on your requirements within your application. Hopefully this video was informative, and good luck with all your PDF exporting adventures.